Thank you. I'm really happy to be here in Porto. So thank you, Amelia and Rodrigo, for the invitation. And thanks to Pedro for all the help in the workshop. It's been a very nice week. And I have a lot of similarities with Tiago and Filipa. You're going to see that in the work that I've been doing in the past 15 years that I've had the studio, I've come to understand that I'm not just practicing architecture in terms of building housing or office spaces, but mostly just to ask questions about my environment. So I've come to think of architecture more like a language that allows me to understand the world rather than a tool to build more. I don't think that that's something necessary nowadays. Maybe we should start thinking about building less and thinking more. And these are some of the projects that explain that. I come from Mexico City, a city that is, as you can see in this photograph by Pablo López Luz, an incredible sprawl of cinder block that seems to be endless. And at the same time, it reflects this idea of continuity, this endless sea of houses, endless seas of urban life. And I've always thought about the concept of continuity and crisis and revolution, because in the context that we live in, we come to this paradox where crisis is something that is the usual thing, so permanently in crisis, which is like permanently in interruptions of our quotidianity. So we need to think about how we plan space and how we build space in those terms. So continuity, the unbroken thing, and also the term revolution. The revolution is something that we associated as an interruption of something, but this concept is relatively new. Before that kind of meaning was given to it, revolution was also the meaning of an instant of revolving, of coming back to a same spot, this idea of rotation, of circulation. So those two terms are always present, or mostly present, in some of the questions that we ask, because of course in this type of urban environments, and especially in a city as old as Mexico City, you will see drastic interruptions because of historical moments, but you will also see some behaviors that emerge every now and then and repeat themselves in different manifestations. It's very much like, I don't know if you've been to Mexico City. I know most of you have because you went to Mexico recently, also with Porto Academy. But you've seen these, this is the Templo Mayor, the main temple. And as you can see in this archaeological dig, you see layers of the temple being built over time. So this was the way that it was constructed. It was one temple, and then after a few years, they would add one more layer. So it's kind of denying what you were in the past, but at the same time, that become your foundations for your next iteration. You can see here all the layers. It's almost like a horizontal strata, instead of a vertical one. And this kind of discontinuity and continuity we can also see in colonial buildings, such as this corner in Museo de la Ciudad de México, where you can see how after the conquer from the Spanish, you would see these elements of juxtaposition, this element of a temple just being used as a cornerstone, as a stone for the foundations of the whole building. And this kind of linguistic juxtaposition was the cultural mix that was already happening. But not only in historical buildings we can see this passing of time and this overlap. There are also examples with more subtle inscriptions in their facades, such as this one. This is self-construction in Mexico City. You can see this type of building in most of the periphery of Mexico City. And if you start reading it closely, you will see a lot of meaning happening in these facades. You can see that, well, this is a single plot. There's one family living here because there's just one bell in the door. But you can see that there are at least 3 heads of household. There were 3 decisions to make the facade look different. That one decided it wanted to be pink, one yellow, one decided not to spend the money and paint. There are other manifestations, such as having like a little altar in the facade. So you can see the Virgin Mary right there, next to a political announcement of PSD, a political party. And the building on the right, you can also see, if you start looking very closely, the different time in which it was built. No, first the first floor, then maybe here you can see the first addition, and then finally the third. So all these inscriptions in the facade have always interested me as an approach to understand my environment. And it became the excuse to develop this first project that started almost 10 years ago for an exhibition in Liga Espacio de Arquitectura, but was recently presented in a show that I shared with Michael and Hilary at the Guggenheim Bilbao called Architectural Effects. And the excuse started with this building. It's an anonymous modernist building. It has nothing in particular. It's nothing special. I still don't know who the architect is. Maybe there is no architect. But it copies a lot of the strategies of modernist buildings. You can see the very strict grid. And I used to live in this area when I was a kid, and then I moved back to this neighborhood when I started working in this studio that we are now. And I always passed this street, and it always caught my eye because I thought this was a very plain facade but had a lot of information. If you come closely to the building, you realize that all this idea about the modernist movement, about being strategic and efficient and industrializing the materials to make it something that is more affordable, in this case is completely distorted. All of this was manufactured. This was something very typical in Mexican modernism too. And as you move in the facade, you see that this becomes almost like neutral. No? The reflection of the glass makes it almost like just a grid. But when you start moving and the transparency starts to appear and gives way to the reflection, you start all the appropriations that people have been doing over years. And it was precisely because it was not renovated that it accumulated all the signs of time. So in my opinion, this becomes almost like an intelligent wall. No? This is like the most intelligent wall that you can have. It adapts to the needs of less light, to the relationship to transparency. When you see someone announcing their services on the glass, you can see this little strip also with little archangels pasted on the shades of the building. You see how people have adapted the spaces to close them or open them more. Or even if they want to have like a French-style office, why not? You can do it behind the glass door. So it's also not just about the technical or specific needs, but it's also the aspirations of styles that could happen within the facade, behind this apparent anonymity that gives the facade and the transparency of the glass, which kind of contradicts with the idea of modernism itself, no? This idea that it would become completely impersonal, such as the example that we see, for example, in movies by Jacques Tati. And you can see here that the expression is quite rich precisely because it was so neutral. So the first example, or the first iteration we did for this project was to photograph all of the windows, almost like in a scientific way, to kind of unpack all the layers that happened in each one of them, their relationships, as I was saying, with transparency or not, almost like as a way to analyze the genesis of the building, just like in this piece by Giuseppe Pennone, no, where he's just carving out the very early tree from the large block of wood, almost like to tell the story just by reading the material. This was the first presentation in Liga. And a few years later, a friend of mine called me and said, like, you know what, they're selling the building now. You should buy it. And it's like, well, I don't have any spare change in my pocket, so I don't know if I can do that. But we contacted the owner, and very sneakily, very Mexican way, we agreed to change his windows, to replace them with new windows. So we got a hold of these glasses, and we presented them in Bilbao recently. I still don't have the final pictures, but maybe you can find that online. So the windows were presented almost like a canvas. And to me, it was really interesting because when we were having this conversation with Manuel Sirauki, one of the curators, he was explaining that he saw a relationship between these windows and a music record, like these vinyl records. And he said that the vinyl record was very interesting to him because it was almost a sculpture. No, you think about it, it's an engraving on a mass. But that produces sound, so it becomes spatial in a different way. And to me, this is a different kind of inscription that tells a lot of stories about social time, but in a very graphic way. Another way to explore this idea of human intervention in space happened with the Civic Stage project we did for the Lisbon Triennial in 2013. And with El Eco, this museum in Mexico City. This was actually my first project experimenting with public spaces in this way. The museum is quite stunning. It was designed by Matthias Geritz, and it has like a very strong presence. The courtyard is defined by these 3 walls, and one of them, the shorter one, the wide one, is facing a park, which kind of finishes the height of the courtyard, and then you have this yellow wall that gives the presence to the space. It used to be occupied by this giant snake. And the whole idea of Museo Experimental El Eco was to create spaces for interaction and playfulness. So while we were doing the proposal, we were required to do a summer pavilion that would hold all the activities for the summer, like cinema screenings, talks, some artist interventions. And while I was doing the competition, I came across this interview with Brenda Lozano, a Mexican writer, and she was explaining that she thought of her work as the work of a bricklayer. She would put words one next to the other to form phrases and to build ideas until you have a text. So while I was reading this, I was thinking, well, maybe we can draw a parallel to poetry, no? If literature is like the work of a bricklayer, maybe then architecture could be like the work of a poet, hopefully. And then we could think about how to do the maximum of expression with a minimum of words, very much inspired by the work of Ferreira Goulart, or just even placing the words in the page could give a different meaning. And of course, when thinking about what would be the single word that we would play with, it was interesting to see, of course, how something as modular and humble and simple, such a cinder block, could give such a variety of expressions in Mexico City itself. No, you could see screen walls, windows, steps, everything being produced by a single element, just being interpreted by the people who use it. So this was our only word, and then we started playing around it with a pattern that was very strict, but that would also show the differences, just as the building that we saw in Florencia. This is a beautiful drawing by Agnes Martin. It's a hand-drawn drawing with pencil. And when you come close, you realize that it's not just a grid. You start seeing all the differences in the shake of the hand, in how the pencil becomes blunt, in all these subtleties, in the texture of the canvas, the different grain. So it starts showing all the difference by the repetition. So you can see here that the bricks were laid in a very regular pattern. And we created this playfulness, like playing with positive and negative, just as we're doing in the workshop. And this was where the program was supposed to be happening. Now this becomes almost like a forum. But there was a second layer to the project, which is the people were invited to move cinder blocks around to their own will. So people would rearrange this landscape. So both the programmatic layer and the spontaneous one would be evident or would be made manifest in the same space. It's almost like changing the syntaxis of the words. No? If you move around a few letters, you completely change the meaning of the word that you were using. You can see here 2 girls playing in the space. Some people say that, how is that possible that children are moving cinder block? That is too dangerous. But in Mexico, I assure you that no one gets hurt when they're doing these things. It was very responsible. No one got hurt. And you can see them playing around, building their own city, their own landscape, and then having like a moment of rest and joy in this little corner. And other people also did interventions, like Pia Camille and her group El Resplandor. They did this little circular space for their performance. And other lectures and events were held in that space. And also people were invited to take with them the cinder blocks. No, one of the ideas was that the pavilion should disappear by the end of the summer. So you were invited to take 10 cinder blocks if you wanted to finish your bookshelf, maybe 100 if you wanted to finish a wall, or in the case that really happened, a developer took all of them to finish one of their buildings, which was kind of smart, but too smart. But at the end of the day, the pavilion came back to its original departing point, which was the city, which was the original purpose. Other interventions that we've done have to do more with installation pieces rather than architecture, such as this one that has a very long title, A Very Short Space of Time Through a Very Short Times of Space. And we were invited by Legorreta and Legorreta, one of the largest offices in Mexico City, to do a screen. They were doing these dormitories for the business school in Palo Alto, California, Stanford University. And they wanted to have a screen very similar to the one that we had in La Tallera project that I'm going to show later. But we didn't want to repeat our screen that we did for that project. And we thought, well, what else can we do with a screen that is not just repeating the idea of the cinder block? What else could be said with a wall that has openings and shadows and has a rhythm? And my sister, she's a student in English literature, and she's always like very smart and telling me stories. And she mentioned this chapter in Ulysses, a chapter that I didn't remember from my reading this book in high school. And she reminded me that in one of the chapters, the main character is walking in the beach with a cane in his hand, and he is crushing some shells and just like feeling the grain of the sand. And he has this moment of illumination where he realizes that there are two ways to understand reality. One is the visual world, know how we understand it and how we comprehend it. But then you start questioning what you see by what you feel. So there's this moment of enlightening that maybe the world that you touch is not the same that the world that you see. And to me, that was really beautiful as an analogy. So we decided to understand that. This is the phrase that he says, that he's perceiving a very short space of time through very short times of space while he's walking in the beach. And it has again to do with rhythm and music and how that has to do with time and space. Just like this idea of a music box, no distance and rhythm create architecture, but also music. And also this image, I think everyone has done this, and if not, I highly suggest it. It's very fun. You just move your hand around and you almost understand the distance between your school and your home, and the rhythm and the musicality, it has to do with just touching an element. And then we were thinking about the relationship of structure in both architecture and music and how it is important. And of course, analyzing the work of Yannis Xenakis, who was a musician and also did great contribution to the work of Le Corbusier, such as you see here in this wall, and how a drawing could be transformed into music. How could we do these translations in language? So we started by taking a provocation from these notes from John Baldessari, and then trying to represent them spatially, and just thinking about how this could become the musical notes and the silence, and then just playing with a facade that was just a folding piece of metal that could be self-structural. You can see here, like this is the very simple result, and you would have openings on one side and the other. These are two hallways that are structuring the facade, and it almost becomes like a giant piano of some sort. This is the rendering that we did for Legorreta. You can see that it's covering 2 levels, and the idea was to simply have these openings just to walk through the space, but also like be seen through the screen. And this is a mock-up, and it has a mechanism inside it. So it's not just how you move through space, but inside each one of these full pieces, like the ones that are not hollow, there is a metal bar that changes in dimension. So the shorter the bar is, the higher the note is, the longer, the lower the note is. So when you do this thing that kids do, like move their hands through the panels, it creates this kind of musical thing. So this is the photographs of the element at night. So it kind of disappears on one side and appears on the other. These are the notes, some of the calculations and the experiments we were doing with some people from MIT. And another project that we did that was, let's say, parallel to the idea of architecture was this called Estaciones. It was first thought for the Orleans Biennial that happened 2 years ago, and now it's a permanent installation in the Botanical Garden of Orleans in France. And it started as a revision of, again, Mexican modernism and our idea of progress. So you know that Mexican Revolution happened in 1910, and after that revolution, there was this moment of high conflict because Mexican Revolution had not just one side. It was like many fractions fighting for different things that came to one unity at some point to achieve peace. But it was not something that happened like simultaneously. There were like these lots of little battles going on, and it was very hard to consolidate the movement into one thing. And the only way to do it was to establish a party that would end the killings that were happening between caudillos, or these revolutionaries, between themselves. So they came to an agreement that if they would all belong to the same party, they would protect themselves, which led to a very complicated situation, which allowed for them to stay in 70 years in power. So this kind of securing their own continuity had political consequences in the future. This is a political party that stayed in power for 70 years, and this is a piece by a collective that is very interested in Mexico City, Tercero un Quinto. What they started doing was to analyze just like this pyramid, all these layers that seems to be discontinuous, but it's actually very continuous. And what they did was to analyze these facades that are painted in little towns in Mexico where you see this political propaganda, and you see that the paint is very light. They use that kind of lightness to save paint so they can paint more ads. And they just whitewash the wall, and then they put the next political advertising again and again and again. So there's this kind of transparency between them, which allows you to see that it doesn't matter who's really proposed as a candidate, because what matters is that PRI remains the same. So that this transparency kind of resembles this idea of political continuity of the pyramid. And the same thing you can see in other landscapes, such as Tlatelolco. This is not a montage. This is a real space where you can see the pyramids, the colonial city, and then the modernist housing projects done by Mario Pani. So you see all these layers happen simultaneously that are very theatrical, but at the same time are representing this kind of continuity. So when we were designing our post-revolutionary Mexico, we had to come up with all the new institutions, not all the political institutions, but also the social aspects, the theaters, the hospitals, the schools, everything had to do from scratch. And of course, there was a need to have an alliate, an architect that would develop this national identity aligned to the idea of power. This is a typical representation of life in Mexico City. It's called the Tree of Life, El Árbol de la Vida. And usually what it depicts is this origin of life, no? Adam and Eve, or maybe it's like a garden, or maybe it has to do more with like the local animals. But then I found this beautiful piece. I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but this was in Pedro Ramirez Vázquez's office. Pedro Ramirez Vázquez became the official architect for PRI since the 50s. And this is a tree of life of Pedro Ramirez Vázquez. He's here at the base, and surrounding him are all the buildings that he created for this institution, which is quite fascinating. No, like he's creating all the identity of Mexico, which was fascinating to me. He was so powerful that he became, in '68, the director of the Olympic Games. this is the first time that the first and the last time that an architect has become a director of an Olympic Games. And this was because he was so important to communicate the national identity to the public, and this was such a big moment to represent ourselves as a powerful and developed nation that he was in charge of doing that. No? So Mexico 68 was a very controversial moment because we were trying to portray ourselves as a developed global world country, but at the same time we had this fragmented identity that created a lot of revolts, especially among students. This was 68, this was something that was happening around the planet, and it infamously ended with a massacre in Tlatelolco in 68, where thousands of students were killed just 5 days before the Olympic Games started. The protest was so visible and the repression so violent that they completely hid this under the carpet, so the inauguration of the Olympic Games just happened as if nothing really had happened with the students. And there was this propaganda, no? this idea of representing Mexico in a very colorful and simple way. And what Pedro Ramirez Vázquez was trying to do was not to create these Olympic Games in terms of the sports, but also how to represent the culture. And this was really important to him, to recover this idea of the Greek ideals of the human body, but also the human mind. And he decided to commission Matthias Geris, who designed El Eco Museum, with a route that was going to be in the periphery of Mexico, in this highway that was connecting all the periphery, the periférico. And he assigned him to do a sculpture route where all the countries who were participating in the Olympic Games were invited to create one specific sculpture for each one of the countries. And there was this moment of conflict where, because of the revolts, it was very important not to be figurative at that time. One of the requests for that sculpture park was that they were abstract, that they were colorful, and that they were monumental, in such a way to avoid any sort of representation of differences, of death, of life, of conflict. So this was the Ruta de la Amistad project. You can see here, this is Pedro Ramirez Vázquez, Matthias Geritz, Alexander Calder, all joined together in this reunion in one fancy house with this fancy lady. And this is Periférico. Of course, this has changed a lot. Now this is full of building and housing projects. And you can see how these sculptures almost become like these things in the landscape that don't tell you really much a story. It's more like a monument to modernity and to progress. And I grew up in this area of the city when I was a teenager. And I always thought that these sculptures were massive and really like monumental and stable. But then after doing a little bit of research, I found these images in Pedro Ramirez Vázquez's archive. And it was really striking for me because it seemed that the structures were actually just made out of metal, and they were covered in a thin veneer of concrete, which was like this revelation to me about the fragility of the political power at the time. You know? In this photograph, you can really see how the scaffolding of the sculptures and the structure is the same thing. It's almost like the stability of the country is held with pins by just the fragility of the labor of the people, who is really precarious. So all this is also fascinating, no? Like Presidente, this liquor company, and like Presidente, the president, and just this construction of identity. So we found all these images, and for the biennial we decided to do one reinterpretation of one of the sculptures to present it as an open structure, no? as this moment of fragility, which almost resembles this Tower of Tatlin moment, no? Where the construction and the deconstruction is happening exactly at the same point, just as you were saying, no? Like this moment where the ruin and the process of construction actually is like the snake that bites the tongue. You cannot tell which one is first and after. So this was the moment of the opening of the Olympic Games, and we chose this sculpture by Olivier Segan, Estación 16, or Estación 16. We thought it was appropriate because the biennial was going to happen in France, and we thought maybe we could get in touch with Olivier Segan, which was really difficult at the time. No one knew where he was living. We tried to find him in Mexico, we tried to find him in Paris, and it was after many months of doing research that someone called and said, like, you know what, someone just told me that you're looking for a sculpture, and there's someone who has the same name in Orleans. It's like, can you tell me the first name? It's Olivier. It's like, well, that's the person that we're looking for. And it turns out he was living just like a few miles away from Orleans, and it was like bringing back the sculpture to him after many, many years when he was, and like he didn't even remember very much about 68 anymore. So the beautiful part of the story is that he got in touch with the FRAC Center, which was hosting the Orleans Biennial, and he donated all of his archive to the FRAC, so it comes full circle. And the process was really interesting because there were no plans for these sculptures. Apparently what they delivered was just a little model, like this big. They shipped it to Mexico, and then the office of Pedro Ramirez Vázquez did the process of translation. So all of the sculptures were actually built with scraps of metal, with some of the other buildings that were built for the Olympic Games pieces. No? So it's almost like this residual thing that appeared to be very monumental. And what we did was this archaeology of photography, where we would try to read these elements, how they were constructed. And together with the archive of Olivier Segan, we were trying to look at all the tiny elements and reconstruct how it would look in its bones with a group of amazing iron workers in Mexico. So again, it was this process of deciphering together, no? and understanding how it could be constructed. This is a process of installation and how it's finally now in the in the Val de Loire Botanical Garden in Orleans. And some other forms of architecture that are more aligned to our idea of what real architecture is this museum in Cuernavaca. This was a competition I did in 2010 for a museum for David Alfaro Siqueiros. David Alfaro Siqueiros, one of our most prominent muralists, had a weekend house in Cuernavaca, which was quite contradictory because he described himself as a communist, but he had a house with a swimming pool, which was very convenient. And when he died, he gave the house to the state so it could be turned into a museum. But it quickly fell into disrepair, as you can see in this photograph. This is like Taller Siqueiros. That was a real sign for the museum, which was crazy, with a pipe going here. And they tried to reactivate it by creating a new program, bringing the archive from Mexico City to here, and adding a bookshop, a library, all the amenities that go now with museums and cultural spaces. And while visiting the site, we entered this courtyard, which was right behind this one. No? So imagine that you turn around the wall, right here, there's an entrance, and this is what you find. And to me, that was quite startling because this is where he painted his murals. But it was this moment of saying, like, well, he meant these murals to be public, so wouldn't it be possible to unfold the space and to open this courtyard and to turn it into a part of the plaza where this building was facing? No? So the operation was like almost rotating the murals. You can see here, like this is the entrance that I was describing. This was the shot like here, looking at these two murals. So basically it was like rotating this one and then the other one here to open the courtyard into the plaza. So this is the final result. The murals are quite big, so they needed restructuring. And there's also a political question in doing this kind of public projects because you have to do most with very little, no? So you need to be very careful about the resources that you're using. So we decided to use very simple materials, of course, but then just creating more space would mean to spend more money. So if we needed to restructure the murals, why not use these very big structures to house the new program? In that way, we could get away with two things. One is to make more with less money, and also to kind of hide them behind the murals. No, we wanted to have the new program, but we didn't want it to be the main facade of the building. So it's kind of tucked behind the monumental pieces by Siqueiros, which were beautifully restored. And as you can see, the plaza had a slight slope to it to enter the museum, which allowed to carve out two courtyards underneath these spaces. So behind this mural is the bookshop and the archive, and behind this one is the cafeteria. This used to be the other facade of the building. As you can see, this is a building that grew organically. It happened over time. This was the main workshop, and after many years, it just was an addition of buildings all over. So we had to create an envelope that would give it some sort of more institutional effect, an institutional face to it. So we decided to use the cinder block. Cuernavaca is a very warm place, so we wanted to take advantage of the temperature and the light, but we also wanted to create something that would filter those conditions. And also, this porosity of the facade would allow people to read these different moments in which the building was created in a very subtle way. So all the intervention was done in raw materials. There were no finishes. So we avoided the kind of heavy maintenance that should happen in a museum. No, it would age nicely without having to paint it over and over again. And with this new skin of cellosia, of this screen of cinder blocks, we were allowed to keep all the trees in the property because they became part of these interior courtyards. This is like the bridge between two workshops, and you can see that the original building remains in its white material, in its white yeso and paint. And the contrast is that all the new materials, all the addition is in raw concrete and metal. And this is where you see like all the different additions. It kind of doesn't match, but it's like cleaned out in this facade. And here's the relationship between the garden and the interior courtyard. And these are some of the pockets that I was describing earlier, no? So you have the cafeteria, and even though it's connected to the main plaza of the building, it has its own little pocket. So this was a lesson of how to divide public space into smaller pockets to make it more effective, and also, of course, to create a space for shade and for gathering. And to me, it's really interesting to see when you're designing a house for a client, it's very simple, no? Because you know your client, it's almost like writing a letter to them, it's like a correspondence. But when designing a public building, this is really tough. You never know if people are going to like your building or not, if they are going to identify with it or not. So when we saw that people were taking their wedding pictures in La Tallera, we thought it was very successful because it meant that they wanted this building to be inside their houses, no? Probably in their living room, which was a beautiful moment. But it was even more beautiful when we found this music video of this banda grupera. They were using this as a backdrop, and they had matching shirts, which we thought was fascinating. So this was success to us. This is a photograph at night, and as you can see, you can still have these tiny openings for the cafeteria and the library, but the main space, the main stage, is for the public, as we just saw with the band and the wedding. A more recent project is this housing project we did in Mexico City. And usually what happens with middle-class housing projects in Mexico is that developers try to get as much constructed area as possible so they can profit more, of course, no? So we usually fight the idea of just doing housing because of this. Usually what happens is that developers try to spend as little money as possible and try to profit as much as possible, and we really don't like that type of relationship. But we decided to work with this project, and instead of fighting the system, maybe trying to find solutions. So of course we decided to do the maximum density of the plot. And instead of doing the usual thing, which is like doing apartments that are exactly the same and that cover all the footprint, and then just adding a balcony on the periphery, which is never really used. People just store their bicycle there, or a sad dog is just like put there to abandon, and we thought this is not the right use of open space. We decided to do 9 townhouses, so to speak. No, so it's more like creating duplexes and then carving out these spaces. So we basically had the same open area as the balcony and the same dense space for the houses, but we had the feeling of having a private house in each one of the apartments. So the space was divided in two to share a common courtyard, which is an image that we borrowed from this very typical vecindad. No, this is a form of housing that is super typical in Mexico. This is where the actual life happens. This is collective life. This is where you wash your clothes, where the kids play, where the gossip happens. So this kind of interior courtyard is kind of replicated here, but in a more contemporary way. And we place the units not facing each other, but just displaced a little bit. And we use this element, which is again cinder block without any finishes. So the construction was very cheap. And we just decided to do this shape, this double V shape, that would allow to have some texture and also would allow us to create these openings that when you see them in one direction, it becomes opaque. And when you see it in the other direction, it becomes transparent in such a way that even though you're facing each other and you're relatively close to your neighbor, you never really see them. So it becomes completely private. This is one of the interior courtyards. It's still, the interiors are still about to be finished, but these are some of the pictures of the interior courtyards. And as you can see, this very humble material gives a lot of richness just by playing with the light. And it even gives interesting corners such as this, no? Like it looks like a little zipper that is closing the building. And here you can see from one apartment to the other, you kind of read the life of your neighbor, but you're not able to see what he's doing, so there's this mystery to it. All of the housing units have a double height courtyard and a view to the sky and some sun. And some of them have a relationship to the street, others doesn't. And yeah, this is like the facade facing the street, and it looks like quite a solid and monumental building. Some people started calling it like they're doing a public building because it was so monumental, but then they realized that there were tiny units, and it has become very, very effective and very successful. And this led to some research. I'm gonna flip very quickly through it because this is some part of a research that we did, and I also felt it had a parallel to your work because yes, architecture is a political question. So some of the things that we do at the office is question why we do things. And the idea came from an invitation with Luciano Concheiro and Javier Nueno. We were talking about how domestic spaces actually replicate strategies of making domestic labor invisible. And this is Casa Barragán. So I'm just going to show the case of Casa Barragán because most people know this project. And as you may know from books or even visiting the space, Casa Barragán is one of the most iconic houses in Mexico City, but few people know there are two houses in Casa Barragán. One is still inhabited by the caretaker of Barragán. She still lives there. She is allowed to stay in the property as long as she lives, but she doesn't own her house. So we started just like understanding the complexity of that thought. No, like this is probably one of the few houses of Barragán that are still not published. We don't know how that house looked like. Would Barragán be doing the same kind of detailing with the bathrooms, the same type of furniture? This is a mystery because no one is allowed to go in. So in that analysis, we said, well, maybe we don't know what the hidden house looks like, but we know all the strategies that he did to hide the domestic labor. So there are like these pockets where you find this play of doors. So it becomes almost like a theater of performing the use of domestic space. No? So you would have dinner at the dining room, and then someone would take you to the living room, and then magically someone would put champagne in the garden. No? So there are these moments of like almost like a backstage that we started mapping, and I mean this became a further research to do other analysis in buildings such as the Mario Pani housing project in Reforma, And then finally, 2 other more contemporary examples, such as urban living, like in Bosque Real, these big developments, and also in Torres, in towers that are more contemporary, which still copy that kind of relationship of hiding domestic labor. That was just like, because we were thinking about domestic spaces, this came through. And finally, I'm just going to present the Serpentine Pavilion, because I know you must be really tired after so many lectures. And it came as a really big surprise. We honestly never expected it. I always tell this story because I think it's funny, and so you check your emails. I'm terrible at checking my email, everybody knows it. But when we got the first invitation, it just said, invitation to the Serpentine Galleries. And I thought it was just an invitation to a newsletter or something like that, so I just let that go. And a week later, they said, like, did you read our last email? And I went back, and then it was like, shit, we just lost a week for preparing the project, and we only had 3 left. So we had to work very, very quickly. And it was quite a challenge because, of course, there were so many beautiful projects and with very interesting propositions about what a pavilion should be. And that it was a matter of doing this exercise of, okay, let's do a circle. No, it's been done. Let's do a courtyard. No, it's been done. Let's do, no, it's been done. So everything had been done. And then there was something in the brief that really caught my attention, which was that the pavilion was temporary. It was only supposed to be in Kensington Gardens for 4 months. But then one of the things is that every pavilion is sold to either a private collector or an institution, and it becomes permanent, but we don't know where. So that kind of changed this notion that we are taught in architecture school, that architecture is site-specific and it's permanent. Because it was site-specific to the Kensington Gardens, but only for 4 months, and then it was going to be permanent, but in a place that we didn't know. So how do you design for a place that you don't know? So then we started to think, well, of course humans have been using more abstract ways of understanding space that have nothing to do with context, but that definitely define the context, such as the Jeffersonian grid, which almost like doesn't make a difference between landscape, but it completely defines it. Or of course the parallels and the meridians, which define our way we relate to the time and space in general, and even like how we interact with each other. And it turns out that the Greenwich Meridian is just a few miles from the center of London, and the Royal Observatory is right there, and the idea of time is actually like a relatively new thing, you know? Like the way we measure time is something very new, and it's evident in this clock, no? When you see 24 hours on a clock, it's quite disorienting, like you don't even understand how to measure time that way. So the Greenwich Meridian runs in this line, and what we decided to do was to play with that idea. So in the case when it was going to be moved, it will still echo the idea of the meridians and the parallels and the ground zero that is in London exactly. So the basic geometry, because we insisted on doing a courtyard, was to do this perimeter that would enclose an interior garden, because this is we know what to do, no? Like because of the vecindades and all the patios. We liked enclosed spaces that look at the sky. So that geometry was following basically the orientation of the Serpentine galleries, and then we had a line that was parallel to the Greenwich Meridian. So this is an aerial view. You can see that this is following that line, but then we had a very large roof, because as much as we wanted to have an open space, it turns out that Mexican summer is very different from London summer. It rains a lot, so we were asked to do a very large roof. We tried to do it as small as possible, but then we managed to have a very big opening here, and we wanted to use, again, very simple materials. So we decided that it was not about the detail, it was more about the weaving of the material again. We chose roof tiles, concrete roof tiles, and we just created this kind of tapestry weaving and unweaving these tiles. So the wall becomes again porous when you see it from one side and opaque when you see it on a diagonal. So you kind of reframe your view, and by doing this kind of rotated square, you have all these possibilities of having more transparency or opacity depending when you are. And the other thing that was important was, of course, this line that I was describing, no? This perfect line between interior and exterior, the play with reflectiveness. So you see this exact moment, for example, in summer solstice, where the sun precisely cuts through this line, and it becomes like this threshold, this invisible threshold that is telling you the relationship between time and space that we have created in a more abstract way. And the roof was reflective to give it a sense of openness, but also to be reflected in the space yourself. So when we were doing these interviews and it was being published, most of the journalists were asking, like, well, what's the money shot? No, like, what's the picture that you want to show in the publications? And it was like, well, we don't know, because it looks quite simple. No, it looks like a box from outside, but it's about moving within the space and really understanding it. So they were really surprised that you don't have an image, but this is the world of images. And all of these pictures were taken from Instagram too. We were really interested in how people were representing themselves in that space, no? From selfies from the rooftop, like here, to just like kids playing in the pools. And we found one that was really funny, which said, like, this pavilion is bloody difficult to photograph. And to me, that was, again, a very successful moment, because it was more about being in space rather than being represented in space. So that's it. Thank you very much.